Hi guys, I'm Wilfred Alambo. In this series we're going to discuss minimum tax, which was introduced sometime last year through the Finance Act 2020. We're basically going to look at minimum tax generally, how it applies, how it's going to affect people in the economy, the sectors that may be affected, and any other issues that may need consideration. So it's highly expected that minimum tax will affect mostly SMEs, but this is in line with the provisions of turnover tax because anybody who has a turnover of below 5 million would be expected to pay turnover tax, and therefore they would not be subject to minimum tax. So for SMEs, this will only be applicable to people who are outside the ambit of turnover tax. And therefore, what happens is that you pay 1% of your gross turnover for the year. That is, you less any income or income that is exempt from taxes from that specific turnover that you have for the period. So minimum tax is payable at defined periods. Assuming a January to December year end, you have your first payment on 20th of April, then you have the second payment on 20th of June, then you have the third payment on 20th of September, and finally the fourth payment on 20th of December. So the balance is between what is installment tax and your minimum tax. So the law provides that you pay the higher of. So you have to do your test and determine how much installment tax that is supposed to be payable. So that is the 4th, the 6th, the 9th, and the 12th month. So the higher of the two. So the higher of minimum tax versus installment tax is what is going to be paid for that specific period. And this is based on the turnover for the specific period before you pay your minimum tax. So for instance, if you're paying in April, that will be the turnover that is for January, February, March. And given that in most cases you wouldn't have the numbers for April, you'll just base it on those 3 months. For June, the anticipation is that it will be based on the 5 months between 1st of January to maybe 31st of May, and maybe now less the minimum tax that you had paid in that specific period of April. But now there is no provision in law to basically determine. So if I'm paying the second minimum tax in June, do I remove the turnover that is between January and March and then compute only for the period April to June? Or do I do 1% of the turnover between 1st of January to 31st of May? So there are those things that are supposed to be considered. And because of SMEs, the administrative nature of it becomes a bit of a hassle. So it becomes tough for you to determine all these things, compute installment tax, compute minimum tax, determine which one is higher than paid. Those are the things that will probably affect SMEs in regards to this. And given the minimum expertise for tax, they might have to invest on tax advisors and consultants to assist with the same. So there are those implications that actually extra beyond the minimum tax obligations that arise. Presently, we understand that the KRA have provided guidelines to ensure that every person who is subject to minimum tax declares their turnover for the period. So this might also have certain implications as to around how do you declare this turnover? Do you declare it as part of the VAT that you file for every month? How do you go about it? So all those challenges that will come around it. So it's easier for people below the turnover tax threshold, but it becomes hectic for SMEs who ideally still don't have a lot of money to do all these administrative expenses that they need. And especially so given that minimum tax is based on turnover. So you don't even consider the administrative expenses that you require for purposes of tax. So the idea of minimum tax is that everybody pays their fair share of taxes because they receive services from the government. As to the services we receive, that's a debatable issue altogether. It's a political question. And the idea is that you cannot be in business and you perpetually make losses because based on the law as it is, you only need to pay taxes on the taxable profit that you make. So if you are in a tax loss, you may have an accounting profit, but you are in a tax loss, and therefore you are not required to pay any taxes. So the idea of minimum tax is to ensure that such group of people also pay their fair share to contribute to the services and the facilities they receive. As to the extent of how this is achievable, because now it covers several people and several other issues around taxable profit, the issue of turnover versus corporation tax, the issue of minimum tax versus corporate tax, and the law that presently is there, there are all those debatable issues that might arise. because whether you're in profit or in losses, you will definitely still pay minimum tax unless you are outside the group that is exempt from that. So that is people who are paying turnover tax. It's not, minimum tax is also not chargeable on employment income, PAYE income. It's not chargeable on CGT for people under the A schedule. It's not chargeable on extractive industries. And for all those retail businesses that prices are controlled by the government. So this will probably be like fuel businesses. So the idea is to maximize on the tax base so that if somebody is not paying tax in whatsoever way, so maybe you are not registered for VAT and for whatever reason you're already qualified, then in this way the government might actually force you into registration because they now know your turnover and they can easily tell you these are the provisions of the law for purposes of VAT, this is what you need to account for. And all these other extenuating taxes that arise from the same. So if you're providing accessible services and you're not charging excess duty, if you're not complying with other tax issues that you're supposed to, by declaring your turnover, which effectively shows your line of service of goods or supplies, then the government is able to cover the other gaps from other taxes in addition to minimum tax. But the minimum idea is, pun intended, to get everybody to pay the minimum tax and their fair share for the services they get from the government, that is. As to whether the government is going to achieve what it intends to do with minimum tax, as I've said, it might help in ensuring compliance in all these other areas for taxes. So for VAT, for excess duty, for other obligations that arise from the business that person who is paying minimum tax is subject to. However, as to the minimum tax itself, there are several other questions that arise because you now have questions as to how do I set it off against, for instance, if I'm paying withholding tax and I've already been deducted withholding tax for whatever transaction, and it's more than the 1% that is on turnover. And given the nature of my business, there's a certain credit that will forever lie in my account because I'll always be paying minimum tax, given the nature of the business. The other issues around, do I set it off against credits that I have? And you see, from the law, the way it is right now, for installment tax, for instance, you can set off any tax that you paid. For minimum tax, the provision is not clear. So there's so much ambiguity around minimum tax that might actually raise more issues and controversies rather than effectively implementing whatever the government wants to do. So if that is the case, therefore, the implementation of the minimum tax might be challenged. And I understand that there are cases already being filed in several courts to challenge it, either the removal or adjustment or make the provision applicable for purposes of tax. So for instance, when you have to compute your taxes, the law provides that you do your taxes based on taxable income that you have. Minimum tax does not consider any expenses that you have. So if I were a business person, I would effectively rush to court and say, this does not make sense. It effectively contradicts another provision of the law. And then secondly, I'm paying minimum tax and I have losses that I'm supposed to carry forward. The law allows me to carry forward my business loss, tax losses for that year and the subsequent 9 years. So will I perpetually carry this credit? And since I cannot set it off, I ended up just paying minimum tax on it. So what happens to the losses that I'm carrying forward? So there will be implementation challenges, and maybe whatever advice the introduction of minimum tax was not, in my opinion, not well thought out and should have involved more engagement from people who actually are supposed to be paying that tax. It will have engaged the economy better. People who are supposed to address those issues will have addressed them in a better way before it was implemented. So it might be a dicey balance for the government because you want to meet your revenue targets, you want to increase your tax base, but then there is a law that rides and basically provides for taxes. And you have to balance the two because ideally, if there is ambiguity in tax matters, it will always be interpreted in favor of the taxpayer. If the implementation challenges, it will always go to the benefit of the taxpayer. So all these issues have to be put at the table, they have to be laid bare. The government has to engage the taxpayer and understand. So how then best do we ensure that you comply with the provision of the law without really feeling the burden that comes with paying taxes? Because when you think about it, tax is a burden. Inevitably, it's as certain as death. So you still have to comply and you still have to pay your taxes. But you also have to ensure that the compliance for the same is easy. It's easy to pay the tax, it's easy to manage it, it's easier to collect it. and the person paying it doesn't feel that they're unfairly being burdened by the government for whatever reason. Like people say, maybe to pay the debts that are always increasing in this country. So those are the issues that we have to balance between compliance and implementation of the same. It might have been a good idea to, for instance, limit it to businesses that are making losses at the end of the year, so that you are not really looking at minimum tax from the point of turnover, but you're looking at minimum tax from the point of the year. So if you're saying somebody has made a loss for the last 3 years, then in the fourth year, then they cannot report a loss. They'll have to pay a minimum tax for the same. You can determine the minimum value of loss for which minimum tax applies, so that it becomes easier to implement. You will retain the installment tax provisions that we have. There's nothing wrong with them. They're working. And then now balance minimum tax against corporate tax or taxes that people incur at the end of the year when they're filing their returns. So it becomes easier to implement, easier to manage, and it becomes a one-off payment, so to speak. So there is usually a school of thought that proposes that a government cannot tax its residents to prosperity. So the way the government is trying to bring everything into tax sometimes needs a balance. So the initiatives that are supposed to generate more revenue for the government and therefore more services to be delivered should come with goodwill also from the government. So you do not anticipate that with the cases of corruption and everything going up and you're telling people we need more taxes. Yes, kulipa ushuru ni kujitegemea, but what if you're paying all this money for it to disappear? The president recently said that we lose about 2 billion every day. So as by the time of this video, 2 billion is already gone. So if you're bringing in issues around taxes, it should make people feel like, yes, I'm paying a tax that is my fair share. And yes, these taxes are going to facilitate my businesses. It's going to grow the economy. It's going to facilitate my own growth as an individual, my own growth as a company I own or a company I'm a shareholder in. It will facilitate all these other things that will encourage the growth of the people generally. And when you notice, like recently when the government spokesperson was speaking about people complaining about taxes, you see, fundamentally that's a problem. So when people start complaining that the taxes are too much, it means the government is not doing something right. So you can't tell us Europeans pay higher taxes than in Kenya, and then when you compare the services between what Kenya receives from the government, you now compare us with countries that are failing like Somalia or DRC. So for the services we receive from the government, you say, but the government is providing you better services than Somalia is providing to its citizens. And then when we complain about the services and taxes, then you come and say, but look, countries like Europe pay very high taxes and they're not complaining. But you see, the difference is that they receive the services for which they pay for. And everybody who pays for anything usually requires something in return. You want to be able to get a service out of it. So the essence of minimum tax was you pay your fair share of taxes for the services the government provides. And if that is the essence of all taxation, therefore, then you should come up with initiatives that are agreeable and amiable to the taxpayers themselves. So you have to balance the two to ensure that ultimately the tax initiatives that are presented for purposes of consideration for the people in the country have to be balanced as to what exactly is the aim that the government wants. So have you plugged all the holes that effectively to make you increase the revenue and therefore now present to the taxpayer a policy that effectively makes sense to them? So I know, yes, I'm paying my fair share. Yes, this money will not be lost. And I was actually engaged in the process of making this policy. So I'm comfortable paying this tax because my input was heard. It's not a burden to me. It's not a pain point for me. And therefore, I am willing and happy to pay taxes, although there is no happy taxpayer, so to speak, but we can try at least.